My manager looked me dead in the eye across the conference table and said, "Frankly, Mitch, you've become a liability. Either you sign the restructuring agreement, or you can clean out your desk and call it a career." 15 years. 15 years I gave that company, and that's what I got. I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at him. This guy who'd been in the role for 8 months, who still called our enterprise software platform by the wrong name in client calls, who once asked me what an SLA was. And I thought, you have no idea what you just started. Let me back up. My name is Mitch, and for 15 years, I was the senior systems architect at a mid-sized logistics technology firm based out of Columbus, Ohio. We built the back-end infrastructure for regional freight carriers, routing optimization, load forecasting, real-time tracking APIs. Unsexy work, but critical. The kind of work where if you do it right, nobody notices, and if you do it wrong, a dozen trucking companies start missing their delivery windows and calling lawyers. I was good at it. Not bragging, just stating a fact the way you'd state that water is wet. I'd been there since the company had 11 employees and a shared office above a dry cleaner on Fifth Avenue. I'd survived 3 rounds of layoffs, 2 acquisitions, 1 hostile takeover attempt, and a period in 2019 where we ran payroll out of a line of credit because the CFO made a catastrophically bad licensing decision. I was there for all of it. Not because I couldn't leave, I had recruiters calling me twice a month, but because I'd built something I was proud of, and I wasn't the kind of person who walks away from something he built. Then the private equity firm came in. They bought a controlling stake 18 months ago, and within 90 days they'd replaced our CEO with a guy named Philip. Philip came from a consumer goods background. He'd spent the previous decade optimizing supply chains for a company that made flavored sparkling water. Nice guy, probably. Wrong guy for this job, absolutely. Philip brought in his own team. His deputy, my new direct manager, was a woman named Yolanda. Yolanda had an MBA from Wharton, spoke fluently about technology transformation roadmaps, and had never, not once in her professional life, as far as I could tell, actually written a line of code or managed a live production system. She was 34 years old and had been given authority over a technical department she did not understand. I gave it a fair shot. I really did. I scheduled one-on-ones with her. I put together documentation she'd asked for that I thought was unnecessary, but I produced anyway. I answered her questions without making her feel stupid for asking them, even when the questions were genuinely alarming. But things started to shift about 6 months in. Yolanda started bringing consultants into our architecture review meetings. These were outside contractors from a firm the PE group had relationships with. They'd sit in our sessions with their laptops open and type things. And then a week later, some slide deck would appear in everyone's inbox with recommendations that ranged from mildly off base to genuinely dangerous. One of them suggested we migrate our core routing engine to a third-party SaaS platform. I wrote a 14-page technical brief explaining exactly why that would create a single point of failure that could take down a third of our client network in a cascading outage. I backed every claim with data. Yolanda forwarded the brief to the consultants. They sent back a 2-paragraph response that essentially said we were being resistant to change. The migration was approved. I kept my head down and kept doing my job. But I also started keeping records. Here's the thing that matters, and I want to be clear about this because it's the foundation of everything that came after. About 4 years ago, long before any of this, I'd started building a tool on my own time. It wasn't something the company asked for. It wasn't something I built using company equipment or company resources. I built it on my personal laptop at my kitchen table in the evenings, running on my home network, using open source frameworks I'd been studying on my own. It was a predictive maintenance scheduling system, an algorithm that could analyze freight vehicle telemetry data and flag maintenance needs before they became breakdowns. The kind of thing that could save a mid-sized carrier $70,000 a year in emergency repair costs and unplanned downtime. I'd mentioned it casually to my previous manager 2 years before the acquisition, and he'd said it sounded interesting, but it wasn't in the roadmap. So I kept developing it privately. I registered it. I documented the development timeline meticulously. Git commit logs, dated notes, cloud storage timestamps. I even had an attorney friend review it and advise me on how to properly establish and protect my ownership, which I did. My employment contract, the original one I'd signed 15 years ago, had an IP assignment clause. Most tech companies do, but the clause had a carve-out, which my attorney had helped me ensure was explicit and unambiguous. When I'd renewed my contract 5 years prior, it did not apply to inventions developed entirely on personal time, using personal resources with no use of company equipment, systems, or confidential information. Ohio law has specific provisions that mirror this. Ohio Revised Code, Section 1333, Ton 626. If you want to look it up, it's one of those statutes that doesn't get talked about much until it suddenly matters enormously. I wasn't hiding the tool from the company. I just hadn't offered it to them, because the timing had never been right and the leadership had never been stable enough to have that conversation seriously. But I knew what I had, and I knew exactly what it was worth. Now back to that conference room. The restructuring agreement Yolanda put in front of me had several components. A title change, senior architect becoming principal contributor, which in corporate language means you stop having a seat at the table and start being someone other people talk about. A compensation adjustment, which was a 22% pay cut framed as right-sizing to market benchmarks. A revised scope of responsibilities, which removed me from all client-facing architecture decisions, and a new, significantly broader IP assignment clause. That last one was the tell. The new clause was written to be retroactive. It claimed ownership over any work product related to the company's field of operations that had been created within the previous 5 years, regardless of when, where, or how it was developed. They knew about my tool. Someone had talked. I'm still not sure who. Probably someone I'd mentioned it to in a passing conversation, maybe 2 years before. Information travels in ways you don't expect. They thought they could paper over it with a contract amendment, sign here, and suddenly the thing I built at my kitchen table belongs to them. I looked at Yolanda. I looked at the HR representative sitting to her left, a pleasant-faced man named Gil, who I'd always gotten along with, and who was now clearly trying to look at the wall behind me rather than meet my eyes. I looked at the agreement. I picked it up. I read it slowly and carefully, even though I'd already seen a version of it. My attorney had been tipped off through channels I won't detail, and I'd had 72 hours to prepare. Then I set it down on the table, folded my hands on top of it, and said, I'm gonna need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything. Yolanda said that was completely fine, but she wanted to be direct with me. The timeline was short, and she really hoped I'd see this as an opportunity rather than a setback. I said I appreciated her directness. I gathered my things and walked back to my desk. That afternoon, I did 3 things. First, I forwarded the agreement to my attorney, a woman named Patricia who specializes in employment and intellectual property law and who does not mess around. Second, I pulled up all my documentation, every time-stamped file, every Git log, every dated note in my personal development journal for the scheduling tool. Third, I drafted a letter, not a complaint, not a threat, just a clear, factual, thoroughly sourced letter establishing the timeline and ownership of my tool, referencing the relevant Ohio statute, and noting that any attempt to claim ownership over it through a retroactive contract amendment would constitute an unlawful taking under state law and potentially give rise to claims of coercion and bad faith dealing. Patricia reviewed it, added 2 paragraphs with case citations, put her letterhead on it, and sent it to the company's general counsel. I went home that night, made dinner, watched 2 episodes of something on TV I can't even remember now, went to bed at a reasonable hour. Because when you've done everything right, and I mean legally, procedurally, documentarily right, there is nothing left to do but wait. What I didn't know was that the general counsel, a man named Frank, who'd been with the company since before the acquisition, was about to have a very bad week. Frank received Patricia's letter on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, he'd apparently escalated to Philip. By Friday morning, Frank had pulled my original employment contract. the amended version, the specific carve-out language, and Ohio Revised Code 1333262, and had run some calculations about what their exposure looked like if this went sideways in court. I know this because Gil, the HR representative who'd been staring at the wall during my meeting, sent me a text Friday evening from his personal phone. Just 3 words: watch your email. Monday morning, I had a meeting request from Philip himself. I walked into that meeting expecting negotiation. What I got was something closer to an apology tour. Philip had clearly been briefed extensively over the weekend. He was careful, measured, and genuinely warm in a way that felt less personal and more like someone who'd been coached by legal. He explained that there had been a miscommunication about the scope of the restructuring agreement, that it had never been the company's intention to lay claim to any personal intellectual property, that he valued my contributions enormously, and hoped we could find a path forward. I said I was glad to hear that. I also said I hoped the path forward included revisiting the other components of the restructuring agreement, specifically the title change and the compensation adjustment, since those had now been somewhat overtaken by events. Philip paused. Then he said he thought that was a reasonable conversation to have. I don't want to overstate what happened next because I think people sometimes tell these stories in a way that makes them sound like a movie, like everything suddenly reversed and the person who'd been wronged got handed everything they'd ever wanted on a silver platter. That's not quite reality. What I got was a negotiated outcome. My title stayed. My compensation stayed where it was, with a performance review scheduled for 90 days out that ultimately resulted in a small increase. The broader IP clause was removed from the restructuring agreement entirely, and separately, I entered into a licensing negotiation with the company for my scheduling tool, the one I'd built at my kitchen table, which they wanted to integrate into the platform for their carrier clients. That negotiation took 6 weeks and resulted in a licensing arrangement that, over the following year, paid me more than my annual salary. I signed the revised restructuring agreement. The scope of responsibilities had been quietly adjusted back towards something reasonable. The meeting where all of this was formalized had 4 people in it: Philip, Frank the general counsel, Patricia, and me. Yolanda was not in the room. 2 months later, Yolanda left the company. Officially, it was described as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. I don't know the details and I didn't ask. What I know is that the consultant-driven migration she'd championed had started producing the exact cascading failures I documented in my 14-page brief, and that 3 client accounts had sent formal complaints within the same 60-day window. There's a thing that happens when you spend 15 years doing careful, thorough, unglamorous work, documenting things properly, keeping records, writing the things down that you're not sure you'll ever need. You start to feel, sometimes, like you're wasting your time. Like nobody cares about the notes you take or the contracts you read carefully or the timestamps on your Git commits. You start to feel like the people who move fast and speak confidently and don't sweat the details are the ones who win. They're not, though. The details are the whole game. The details are everything. Patricia told me after it was all resolved that the company's general counsel had made the decision to back down within about 4 hours of receiving her letter. Not because he was a good person necessarily, but because the documentation I'd maintained was so thorough and the legal foundation was so solid, that proceeding would have been a losing proposition from every angle. I hadn't gone into that conference room with a dramatic card to play. I'd gone in with 15 years of doing things right. Right job, right records, right contract language, right statute, right attorney. The dramatic moment was just what happened when all of that finally became necessary. I still work at the same company, different leadership team now. Philip eventually moved on too, about 8 months after all of this, and the firm that replaced him is more operationally focused and significantly less interested in consultant-driven transformations. I have a good relationship with the new technical leadership. My scheduling tool is live in production and performing the way I always knew it would. I drive the same 12-year-old Subaru I drove before any of this. I still make dinner at home most nights. I still take the long way around when I walk the dog in the evenings, past the park and down along the creek where it's quiet. Some things change. Some things you make sure to protect. I didn't do a single dramatic thing in that conference room. I just picked up the agreement, set it back down, and said I'd need my attorney to look at it first. That was enough. I think about that conference room sometimes, not with anger anymore, more like the way you think about a close call on the highway. The moment after your hand stops shaking and you realize the guardrail held. What I've come to understand is that nothing about what happened to me was accidental, on either side of it. Yolanda didn't walk into that room by accident. She walked in because a system rewarded a certain kind of competence over a certain kind of competence, and she'd learned to perform the former without ever needing the latter. And I didn't walk out of that situation intact by accident either. I walked out because of choices I'd made years before that meeting ever happened, choices that had nothing to do with that meeting, choices made quietly, at a kitchen table, on evenings when nobody was watching and nobody would have known if I'd cut corners. That's the part that gets me. The version of me that corners, that doesn't bother registering the tool properly, that signs whatever contract gets put in front of him without reading the carve-out language, that doesn't think to consult an attorney until the moment of crisis. That version of me loses, not because he's a bad person, but because he hasn't thought carefully enough about what he's building and what it's worth and what he owes to his future self in terms of preparation. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't have an audience. The timestamps on my Git commits, nobody asked me to keep those. The development journal, nobody knew it existed. The conversation with Patricia 2 years before I ever needed her professionally. I did that because it seemed like the responsible thing to do, not because I thought I'd ever be sitting across a table from a general counsel who was quietly calculating his firm's litigation exposure. That quiet integrity, the kind that doesn't get performed for anyone, turns out to be load-bearing in ways you can't predict. And then there's the thinking, not cleverness. I want to be careful about that distinction. Cleverness is reactive. It's the quick comeback, the sharp move in the moment. What saved me wasn't cleverness. It was sustained, careful, patient thinking over years. Understanding my contract. Understanding the statute. Understanding what I built and what it was worth and how to protect it. That kind of thinking is slow and unsexy and doesn't make for great stories at dinner parties, but it is the actual mechanism by which outcomes get determined. The steadiness matters too. I went home that Thursday night and made dinner. That wasn't bravado. That was a choice, a hard one, to not let fear make decisions for me. Panic would have had me calling Yolanda to negotiate on her timeline. Patience let me wait for mine. Patricia told me afterward the whole thing collapsed in 4 hours. 4 hours against 15 years of doing things right. That ratio tells you something about how the world actually works, even when it doesn't feel that way while you're living inside it. Mitch didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he'd been building something for years that nobody could see. And when they finally needed to see it, it was all there, exactly where he'd put it. I still drive the same car. I still take the same evening walk. Some things don't need to change when you've been doing them right all along.